The American Yawp, Chapter 9, Getting Forward. Section 5, the South, the West, and the Limits of Democracy. Revivals and reform extended well beyond American cities. Stirred by nationalism and moral purpose, evangelicals also labored to make sure the Word of God reached far-flung settlers on the Western American frontier. The American Bible Society distributed thousands of Bibles to areas where churches and clergy were scarce, while the American Home Missionary Society provided substantial financial assistance to frontier congregations struggling to achieve self-sufficiency. Missionaries also worked to translate the Bible into Native American languages in order to evangelize indigenous populations. Meanwhile, however, a troubling pattern emerged in national politics and culture. During the first decades of the 19th century, American politics shifted toward sectional conflict among the states of the North, South, and West. Many Northerners feared that the Southern states' common interest in protecting slavery was creating a congressional voting bloc that would be difficult for free states to counter. The North and South began to clash over federal policy as Northern states gradually ended slavery, but Southern states came to depend even more on enslaved labor. In this way, even as industrialization and the cash economy tied diverse regions together in trade, ideology drove the same regions apart. And amid all the social reform movements of the age, the brutal system of forced labor that enriched the few in the South seemed only to be growing more secure. The Cotton Revolution. As late as the 1820s, Southern life was predicated on a rural lifestyle, farming, laboring, acquiring land and enslaved laborers, and producing whatever that land and those enslaved laborers could produce. The market, often located in the nearest town or city, rarely stretched beyond state lines. But cotton and steam power changed much of this. Before cotton became central to its economy, the South had few major seaports. Even on the nation's great western waterway, the Mississippi River, which emptied into the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans, shipping was almost entirely one way, flowing with the current, not against it. But in January 1812, a 371-ton ship called the New Orleans arrived at its namesake city from the distant Ohio River port of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was the first steamboat to navigate the internal waterways of the North American continent from one end to the other and remain capable, thanks to coal and steam, of returning home. The technology was far from perfect. The New Orleans sank 2 years later after hitting a sandbar, but its successful trial promised a bright new future for river travel. And that future was indeed bright. Just 5 years after the New Orleans arrived in the Crescent City, 17 steamboats ran regular upriver lines. By the mid-1840s, more than 700 steamboats would do the same. And during 1860, the Port of New Orleans would receive and unload 3,500 steamboats, all focused entirely on internal trade. These boats carried around 160,000 tons of raw product that merchants, traders, and agents converted into nearly $220 million in trade in a single year. More than 80% of the yield was from cotton alone. Thus, the market revolution's explosion of steam changed the South along with the rest of the country. Everything that could be steam-powered was steam-powered. Cotton gins, wagons, grinders, looms, and baths were all adapted to this technology. Most importantly, the South's rivers, lakes, and bays were no longer barriers and hindrances to trade. They had become the way commerce flowed, the roads of a modernizing society and region. In this way, while most northern U.S. cities developed as centers of manufacturing, creating public spaces to boost the morale of wage laborers, America's southern cities adapted the Industrial Revolution to cotton and slavery. In fact, the South experienced a greater rate of urbanization between 1820 and 1860 than the more industrial North. The growth of southern cities, far from promoting free wage labor, allowed slavery to flourish. Life in slavery, the global and economic functions of the South were wholly dependent on enslaved labor. The South was home to nearly 4 million enslaved people by 1860, amounting to more than 45% of the entire Southern population. Enslaved Southerners, though unfree, developed a culture all their own. They created kinship and family networks, systems of trade, linguistic codes, religious congregations, and even benevolent and social aid organizations. They formed all these within the grip of slavery, a system dedicated to extraction and exploitation. More than anything else, the concept of family organized the daily lives of enslaved people. Through family units and kinship networks, enslaved people could piece together a sense of community, feeling, and dedication separate from the system of forced production that defined their work lives. Ideas that were passed between relatives on different plantations, names that were given to children in honor of the deceased, and other basic forms of love and devotion created a sense of individuality, an identity that assuaged the loneliness and desperation of enslaved life. Family defined how each community functioned, grew, and labored. As American-born enslaved laborers overtook earlier African-born generations, the practice of marriage, especially among members of the same ethnic group or even residents of the same plantation, became vital to the continuation of traditions. Marriage served as the most important institution of cultural and identity formation, as it connected enslaved people to their own pasts and gave some sense of protection for the future. But marriages and other family bonds were never safe from the violence of slavery. By the start of the Civil War, approximately 2/3 of enslaved people were members of nuclear households, each averaging 6 people. Such a family might have a mother, a father, children, and often a grandparent, an elderly aunt or uncle, and even in-laws. Enslaved Southerners who did not have a marriage bond still maintained family ties, often living with a single parent, brother, sister, or grandparent. Thus, culture thrived among the enslaved in ways that are difficult for us to see now, through the bales of cotton sitting on the docks and the stacks of money filling the counting houses of the South's urban centers. But religion, honor, and pride transcended material goods. Defying the cruel domination of slavery, enslaved people maintained traditions and crafted new culture. They fell in love, had children, and protected one another. They were resourceful, brilliant, and vibrant, and they created freedom where freedom seemingly could not exist. And within their communities, resilience and dedication often led to cultural sustenance. Yet the threat of disruption, especially through sale, always loomed. As the internal slave trade increased after the constitutional ban on transatlantic slave importation in 1808 and the rise of cotton in the 1830s and 1840s, enslaved families, especially those established prior to arriving in the United States, came under increased threat. Hundreds of thousands of marriages, many with children, fell victim to sale downriver, a euphemism for the near-constant flow of enslaved laborers down the Mississippi River to the developing cotton belt in the Southwest. In fact, during the Cotton Revolution alone, between 1/5 and 1/3 of all marriages between enslaved people were broken up through sale or forced migration. And the lure of a profitable sale was not the only threat. Enslavers recognized that marriage was, in the most basic and tragic sense, a privilege they granted and defined. Many enslavers used marriages or threats against marriages to wield power over the people they held in bondage. Expansion and conflict. The Southern economy's appetite for cotton and for land where enslaved workers could grow it contributed to the nation's westward sprawl during the early 19th century. Other forces also played a role in national expansion across North America. Economic busts like the Panic of 1819 constantly threatened Western farmers and communities. The dream of subsistence and stability abruptly ended as many migrants lost their land and felt the hand of the distant market economy, forcing them even farther west to escape debt. As a result, the federal government consistently sought to increase access to Western land, including efforts to lower the amount of land required for purchase. Smaller lots made it easier for more farmers to clear land and begin farming faster. This contributed to frequent conflict between white settlers and Native American communities. The expansion of American influence and territory off the continent, meanwhile, became an important corollary to westward expansion. The U.S. government sought to keep European countries out of the Western Hemisphere, even as it laid claim to more and more Western territory. Thus, in 1821, while still serving as Secretary of State for President James Monroe, John Quincy Adams helped formulate the Monroe Doctrine, declaring U.S. hostility to British and Russian involvement in the Americas. Adams's great fear was not territorial loss. Rather, the Monroe administration was worried mainly about the ability of the United States to compete commercially with the British in Latin America and the Caribbean. Expansion of economic opportunity and protection from foreign pressures became the overriding goals of U.S. foreign policy in the age of the market revolution. The greatest test of the U.S. government between 1815 and 1828, however, related to political conflict over the expansion of slavery in the West. The Missouri Crisis. When white settlers in Missouri, a new territory carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, applied for statehood in 1819, the balance of political power between northern and southern states became the focus of public debate. Missouri already had more than 10,000 enslaved laborers and was poised to join the southern slave states in Congress. Accordingly, Congressman James Talmadge of New York proposed an amendment to Missouri's application for statehood. Talmadge claimed that the institution of slavery mocked the Declaration of Independence and the liberty it promised to all men. He proposed that Congress should admit Missouri as a state only if bringing more enslaved people to Missouri were prohibited, and children born to those enslaved there were freed at age 25. Congressmen like Talmadge opposed slavery for moral reasons, but they also wanted to maintain a sectional balance of power. Unsurprisingly, the Talmadge Amendment met with firm resistance from Southern politicians. It passed in the House of Representatives with the support of nearly all the Northern congressmen, who had a majority there, but it was quickly defeated in the Senate. When Congress reconvened in 1820, a senator from Illinois, another new Western state, proposed a compromise. Jesse Thomas hoped his offer would not only end the Missouri crisis, but also prevent any future sectional disputes over slavery and statehood. Another Westerner, Henry Clay of Kentucky, joined in promoting the deal, earning himself the nickname the Great Compromiser. Their bargain, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, contained three parts. First, Congress would admit Missouri as a slave state. Second, Congress would admit Maine, which until now had been a territory of Massachusetts, as a free state, maintaining the balance between the number of free and slave states. Third, the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory would be divided along the 36 degrees 30 feet line of latitude, or in other words, along the southern border of Missouri. Slavery would be prohibited in other new states north of this line, but it would be permitted in new states to the south. The compromise passed both houses of Congress, and the Missouri crisis ended peacefully. Not everyone, however, felt relieved. The Missouri crisis had made the sectional nature of American politics impossible to ignore. It had exposed just how divisive the slavery issue had grown. The debate had filled newspapers, speeches, and congressional records. Anti-slavery and pro-slavery positions from that point forward would repeatedly return to points made during the Missouri debates. In these debates, white Southerners had not yet begun arguing that slavery was a quote, good in the world. That claim would come later. But they had been insisting that the framers of the U.S. Constitution had supported slavery and wanted to see it expand. Likewise, the debates over Missouri's admission to the Union in 1820 had offered the first sustained debate on the question of black citizenship. A proposed clause in Missouri's state constitution would have imposed a hard ban on any future black migration into the state. Legislators ultimately had agreed that this ban violated the U.S. Constitution, but they had reaffirmed Missouri's right to deny citizenship to African Americans. While the crisis lasted, many Americans, including 77-year-old Thomas Jefferson, were alarmed at how readily some Americans spoke of disunion and even civil war over the issue. This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror, Jefferson wrote. I considered it at once as the death knell of the Union. For now, the Missouri crisis did not result in disunion and civil war, as Jefferson and others feared. But it did fail to settle the issue of slavery's expansion into new Western territories. Section 6, Conclusion. Instead of marking the end of human bondage in the United States, the 1810s and 1820s ended the first great age of emancipation. In hindsight, it can be said that the movement to end slavery that began with the Revolution came to an end in 1817, when the state of New York adopted the North's last gradual manumission law. For decades after this, despite the rise of wage labor, American progress would be impossible for many Americans to imagine apart from slavery. The market revolution thus left open the question of what kind of labor would triumph in the United States. For all it did to spread hourly factory work, inspire social reform movements, and provoke the democratization of party politics, the national cash market only deepened the white South's dependence on enslaved workers. America's celebration of white, middle-class domestic life, with its commitment to temperance and piety, the sacredness of women and children, and belief in uplift through education, could hardly disguise what was happening. Indeed, the 1830s would usher in a new era of religiously inspired anti-slavery radicalism, responding to the contradictions of this moment. Meanwhile, in electoral politics, both the hopes and the fears of many Americans were fastening on one man and the ideas about American identity that he seemed to embody. The presidential victory of Andrew Jackson in 1828 would inaugurate a new system of political partisanship, one that in some respects still exists today.